Hello everyone, welcome to this presentation on the topic Connectionist Models of Cognition. Now, as you may not be familiar with what computational cognitive modeling is in general, I'll start out by considering what it is, and then we'll place connectionism into the context of the broader framework of computational cognitive modeling in general. So computational cognitive modeling can be defined as an approach to understand the essence of cognition and various cognitive functionalities by developing and running computational models of these cognitive functionalities. Now, why would we want to do that? Well, if we have such a computational model of a certain cognitive capability, then this model might be viewed as a theory of the phenomenon that it purports to describe. And moreover, using this model, we can gain further insights. We can generate data to build more additional hypotheses or even make predictions regarding cognitive systems. Now, we differentiate between different levels of abstraction at which we can model a certain cognitive phenomenon. These levels of abstraction fall on a continuum between purely behavior-based models all the way down to neurochemical descriptions of neural networks, or maybe even a simulation of a brain on the level of the elementary particle. And we could virtually build a model at every stage in this continuum. So at the highest level, we would have pure behavior-based input-output models that just describe the behavior of a cognitive system. Further down the hierarchy, we would have functional descriptions of cognitive modules in which we describe the various cognitive modules of which the cognitive system is comprised and what their functions are. And even further down the hierarchy, we would have an algorithmic account of the actual representations that the system uses and the mechanisms and processes that it describes. And these processes could possibly be symbolic, which means that they are described by explicit rule-based mechanisms. And then one level further down the hierarchy, we would have models that give a functional description of real neural networks, but that abstract away from the neurochemical details and try to capture the key functional properties of neurons that give rise to cognition. So this is where connectionism comes into play. So we can define it as an approach to understand cognition using models based on artificial neural networks, or ANNs for short. And the idea that motivates this is that since human brains are composed of neurons, the functional properties of these neural systems should influence our theories of cognition. And therefore we build ANNs as a simplified mathematical model which is inspired by real neural circuits, but that abstracts away from the messy biochemical details and tries to give a functional account of the role that neurons play. And as such, connectionism can be viewed as a candidate to replace the classical computational theory of mind, which is based on an analogy between minds and the classical von Neumann computer architecture. So let's take a look at how these ANNs look like. The basic building blocks in ANNs are neurons and connections between those neurons. So on the upper right here, we can see that we can visualize such an ANN as a directed graph where the nodes correspond to the individual neurons and the edges, the directed edges, correspond to these connections between the neurons. Now at each point in time, we associate a certain degree of activation with each neuron, which is usually a real number between 0 and 1, which describes how active that particular neuron is at a certain point in time. And what these connections describe is into which other neurons do neurons feed their activation. So if we want to compute the activation of some intermediate neuron, what we do is we consider all the other neurons that feed into this neuron. So in the case of this neuron, we would have these 3 neurons feeding their activation into this neuron. And then we compute the activation of this neuron based on the activation of these input neurons. Now, different connections have different importance, and we model this by specifying a weight, which is a real number that specifies the degree to which a certain connection influences the activation of a neuron, or the degree to which the incoming neuron contributes to the activation of the neuron into which it feeds its activation. And we distinguish between 2 types of connections. One are excitatory connections, which we model using a positive weight, and which state that the higher the activation of a certain neuron is, the higher the activation of this neuron will be. On the other hand, we have inhibitory connections, which are modeled by a negative weight, which states that the higher the activation of this neuron is, the lower the activation of this neuron will be. Now down here, we have depicted the functional description of a single neuron. So in order to compute the activation of this neuron, what we do is we sum up the activations of all the incoming neurons multiplied by the respective weight of this connection, and then we squash it through something called a sigmoid function, which makes sure that the activation of this neuron will again be a value between 0 and 1. So you could imagine that this sum could take on arbitrary values depending on the number of neurons that feed into it. And then if it is highly positive, then we output an activation close to 1. And if it is highly negative, then we output an activation close to 0. Now, the sigmoid function here is just one type of activation rule that we can choose. There might be other types. So for example, we could have a threshold activation function that just outputs an activation of 0, except when the input exceeds a certain threshold, and then if this threshold is exceeded, we output an activation of 1. So now we can ask ourselves, how can we interpret what's going on? What sense can we make of these computational models of neurons? And one way to interpret single neurons is to view them as representing individual concepts. For example, the concept of a certain letter, the concept of a certain word, and so forth. And this way we can view the whole ANN as representing a hierarchy of concepts. So here we have an example. Assume that we have some low-level neurons in the visual cortex that detect certain geometrical shapes. So for example, if we detect a diagonal line, then this neuron would be rather active. Moreover, if we detect a horizontal line, then this neuron would be rather active. And if we detect another diagonal line in the other direction, then this neuron would be active. And we can imagine how these 3 shapes combined give rise to the shape of the letter A. And thus, if these neurons are rather active, which means that these particular shapes were all detected, then we can infer that we've read the letter A, and thus the neuron corresponding to the letter A should also be rather active. And we can imagine the same thing going on for other letters with other underlying geometrical patterns. And then going further up the hierarchy, we can imagine that if these 4 letters, A, P, L, and E, are active, then we can infer that we've probably read the word apple, and thus these letter neurons excite the neuron which represents the concept of the word apple. Now, there doesn't necessarily need to be a one-to-one correspondence between concepts and neurons. So some neurons may just act as abstract entities with which we don't associate a certain interpretation. So you can't really say for each neuron in an ANN, so what does this detect? What does it mean if this neuron is active? But rather, meaningful patterns could arise through the interplay of many neurons as an emergent phenomenon, rather than as a result of a hierarchy of concepts where each neuron stands for one individual concept. And in addition, there could also be redundancy. So for example, we could have multiple neurons representing the same concept, especially in real cognitive systems where um, redundancy is important. If a certain neuron fails, then other neurons can take on the role of that neuron. Now, one way we can look at ANNs as a whole is to view them as representing functions in the mathematical sense of the term. And what we do in order to define a function using an ANN is we first arrange the neurons into layers, and we distinguish input layers, hidden layers, and output layers. And this way, an ANN can be viewed as a function that maps an input vector to an output vector. So if we have a certain input vector, then we can put in the components of the vector into the various neurons corresponding to these components. And then we can apply the rules for computing the activations of the intermediate neurons and then the activations of the output neurons. And then we can read off the result that the ANN function has computed of the output layer, which is then again a vector. And this allows us to model virtually any kind of mapping. So for example, we could imagine an ANN that maps images of handwritten words to probabilities of words. So here we've depicted an example network that could do this. So down here at the input layer, we have low-level visual neurons that respond to certain activations in the visual field. So each square here corresponds to one neuron, and a white neuron would be one that is rather inactive, and a black neuron would be one that's rather active. And then we can imagine that these low-level sensory neurons feed through a hierarchy of hidden layers in which they detect certain geometrical shapes, which then detect yet more complex geometrical shapes, which then gives rise to probabilities of words. And at the output layer, we then have a vector corresponding to probabilities for each possible word. And then we can use this ANN to read off the probabilities that a certain image corresponds to a certain word, where the probability of a word is given by the activation of the neuron that corresponds to that word. So now we can ask ourselves, how do we come up with the weights of the network? Now, one obvious way would be to just specify them by hand. Depending on the cognitive domain of interest, this might be feasible. If you have certain interpretations of the neurons in mind, then you can just choose meaningful weights that describe this cognitive phenomenon that you want to model. But another possibility is to learn these weights automatically. And the way we do this is first we have to specify a set of training data corresponding to inputs with their associated outputs. So in this example, we could imagine that we have a huge database of different images of handwritten words with their corresponding words that are depicted in that image. And then next, we choose an error criterion that we want to minimize. So one feasible error criterion would be the probability of misclassification. So coming back to this example here, we would want to minimize the probability that the network generates the wrong output for a respective input. And then we can apply what's called the backpropagation algorithm in order to compute the weights in such a way that they minimize the error. Now we can view the weights and the patterns of connectivity in the network to represent the long-term knowledge of the cognitive system, which is then useful as a model for understanding learning in real creatures. So for example, we could choose our training data and the error criterion in such a way that we simulate learning curves of real human children during their development. And then we can observe the model behavior over time in order to draw inferences about cognitive development. Now, in order to get an intuition for how learning in neural networks operates, I thought I'd show you a little simulation which you can find at playground.tensorflow.org. TensorFlow, by the way, is a machine learning library which, among other things, lets us build and train ANNs. And here we have a network consisting of 3 layers. One input layer consisting of a 2-dimensional input point, one hidden layer consisting of 4 neurons, and one output layer which represents classes. So the outputs here are the probabilities of detecting a certain class. So if this is high, then this means we have detected the first class, and if this is high, then it means we've detected the second class. And on the right here, we see the training data that we feed into the network. So we have 2 classes depicted by blue and orange points, and each point is just a 2-dimensional vector in this space. And as we can see here, the blue points are all on a small circle at the center, whereas the orange points are all on a donut around the center. And now we can visualize how the backpropagation learns the weights of the network in order to minimize the probability of misclassification. So backpropagation operates in steps. At each step, it sweeps over the whole training set, and then it computes a change to the weights such that this error is reduced a little bit. And this is then continued multiple times. So we call each sweep over the training set an epoch. And then this is repeated over many epochs until we arrive at a local optimum for the error function. So let's take a look at how the network learns to divide the entire space into a blue region and an orange region. So we can see at this point it has a rather good theory, but it's still not optimal because some of the orange points here and some of the orange points here are still classified as blue. But if we continue a few more epochs, then we can see that the network actually manages to learn the rule that the blue region should be something like a circle at the center and the rest should be classified as orange. At this point, I'd like to point out the difference between what's called deep learning and connectionist modeling. So, as we've seen, connectionist modeling is using ANNs for modeling and understanding cognition, whereas deep learning is using ANNs for solving AI problems, but it doesn't place so much emphasis on the cognitive realism and understandability of the models that it builds. So usually these models have very, very many layers, which is why we call this deep learning. And such complex models, they are hard to interpret. And in fact, many of the deep learning models today, uh, even though they work really, really well at performing a certain task, sometimes the people have no clue why they work well and what's going on, and thus they are usually not such a good model for modeling and understanding real human cognition. But still, of course, there's not a sharp dividing line, so some models devised in deep learning might in fact uh, spur further research into, might in fact shed light on how certain cognitive abilities could be performed in human beings. And on the other hand, modeling cognitive abilities in human beings can give inspiration for models in deep learning that solve AI problems. And these deep learning models achieve state-of-the-art results in various tasks like object recognition in images. So you feed in an arbitrary image into the network and it tells you what's depicted in that image and even where. Or moreover, it also achieves state-of-the-art results in speech recognition, in machine translation. So for example, the Google Translator is now completely based on a deep learning model on a recurrent neural network that maps sequences to sequences. And even things like playing Dota. So this year, OpenAI has created a bot for the game Dota that beat the world champion. But what's significant about this is that it wasn't taught how to do so. It learned to play this game completely on its own by competing against itself for many, many epochs. And this way, the network learned to associate the input pixels with clicks as its output behavior in such a way that it plays optimally and beats the world champion. Now, one additional point is of note here, which is that we need to define a representational scheme in order to map between the cognitive domain of interest and a set of vectors that depict the relevant informational states. When we model higher level cognitive functions, then we usually leave out all the low level sensory neurons and start at a representation that is already rather abstract. So if we want to model something like language understanding, then we can build a model that starts at the level of words without considering all the low-level visual cue detection that's going on below. Now let's take a look at a landmark study in connectionist modeling, which was conducted by Elman in 1990. Now what Elman observed was that many human behaviors revolve around temporal sequences. So for example, language use, reasoning about causality, planning, and so forth. And he asked himself, how can conformities to the rules of language arise in a cognitive system without an explicit representation of these rules? And moreover, the ANNs we've seen so far all had a fixed size input vector, but temporal sequences can be of arbitrary length, especially sentences. They could be of arbitrary length, and you can't just compress them into a fixed size input vector. So he also asked himself, how can an ANN deal with sequences without committing to a fixed length? And the idea that he came up with is called a recurrent neural network, which works as follows. First, we discretize time into so-called slices, which we denote t, t plus 1, and so forth. So for example, if our input is a sentence, then we could split it word by word, and each word corresponds to a certain temporal slice. And then at the beginning, we present just the first input from the sequence, which then results in a set of hidden activations, which then produces an output. But then at the next time step and all subsequent time steps, we do not only feed in the next input from the sequence, but also the previous set of activations of the hidden units. So we copy the previous activations from the previous time step into a set of context units, and then we feed them in as another input into the hidden units for the next time step. Now this vector of context activations can be seen as acting as a kind of short-term memory, which is capable of representing not just the previous time step, but the relevant information from all previous time steps. So over time, the network will learn to keep track of just what's relevant to perform the respective task that we wanted to learn. And this way, every input is processed in the context of everything that came before, not just the previous word, which then allows the network to learn statistical relationships across the whole sequence. And Elman used these recurrent neural networks in two experiments. So in the first one, he presented a network with sequences of letters without spaces. So for example, up here, we would have a sentence forming: many years ago, a boy and girl lived by the sea, but we feed in this sequence of letters without telling the network where the delimitations between the words are. And we can encode each letter in a binary fashion. So we associate a certain binary code with each letter. And then we train the network to predict the next letter in the sequence, given the previous part of the sequence that was fed in already. So at the beginning, we could imagine that we feed in the letter M, which is then encoded in a binary fashion at the input layer on a fixed number of 5 neurons here. And then we feed these input activations into the hidden layer, and then we generate output probabilities for what the most likely next letter will be. And then we can just pick the letter with the highest probability to make our prediction. And then at the next time step, we would feed in the letter A. Again, we would determine its binary encoding, feed it into the input layer, and then into the hidden layers, we feed both this new input and the previous set of activations of the hidden units. And then we generate the next prediction given the previous context consisting of both letters. And then we proceed like that. So we feed in one letter at a time, each time keeping track of a set of hidden activations, which act as a kind of short-term memory that learns to keep track of the relevant information that is necessary or that is best suited to produce or predict the next letter in the sequence. And then Elman observed that within words, a network could successfully predict the next letter, whereas after a word has ended, the model was not good at predicting the next letter. And this makes sense because within a word, if you've observed some of the letters in the word already, then you can make good guesses as to what the next letter will be. But on the other hand, if a word has ended, then you won't know what the next word will be, and thus you have to make a mostly blind guess as to the next letter, and thus the prediction accuracy drops. And this allows us to identify a mechanism by which we can split the words. So we can just identify sudden drops in the prediction accuracy of the network and determine those sudden drops as the delimiters between the words. And this is significant because it's using this model, Elman actually demonstrated a possible mechanism by which words can be extracted from continuous streams of sound by real cognitive creatures, or especially human beings. So while I'm talking to you right now, I don't necessarily make pauses between the words, but still you're able to make sense of what I'm saying, since unconsciously you split the words. And what Elman demonstrated was that a possible mechanism by which you may actually be able to do that is by identifying these sudden drops in the prediction accuracy. In the second experiment, Elman created a corpus of many sentences from a fixed number of words according to sentence frames, like combining nouns with verbs, or noun and verb and noun, which would correspond to subject, verb, object, or other types of grammatically valid sentences, even if there are subordinate clauses in between. And again, this time the words were encoded in a binary fashion, so we associate a binary pattern with each of the words. And then we train the network to predict the next word in a sequence. So this is completely analogous to the ladder prediction task, except that this time we operate on the level of the word. So we observe a word, determine its binary representation, feed it through the network, generate a prediction, feed in the next word, and then compute the hidden activations based on the next word and the previous hidden activations to produce the next output, and so forth. And what Elman observed was that during training, the output activations actually approach the conditional probabilities of the words, which basically means that the network learned to make optimal predictions given the knowledge that it had. So for example, after a noun, the units corresponding to the verbs would be more active, but then after another verb, the noun units would be more active again because the object of the sentence would follow. And even if the subject was in the singular, then the verb of the sentence would be predicted to be in the singular as well. And that is irrespective of the distance between the subject and the verb, even if there are subordinate clauses in between with their own subjects and objects. So apparently the network learned to keep track of the fact that the subject was presented in the singular and then remembered this long enough in order to be able to predict the correct grammatical form of the verb. So how does the network do this? In order to examine this, he looked at the activations of the short-term memory units. That is, the activations that were fed back in recurrently at each time step, in order to understand what the network represents, what the network keeps track of over time. And what he observed was that the network was sensitive to a difference between nouns and verbs, or even between singular and plural forms of these nouns and verbs. So the same nouns would have similar representations, but they differed slightly according to whether they were in the singular or the plural. And moreover, he observed that semantically similar words had similar representations as well. So for example, the word woman had a similar representation as the word girl. So in short, the network learned to build internal representations that incorporate both semantical and syntactical short-term memory, since apparently this is the best way to predict how a sentence will unfold. And this is a significant finding because the prevailing view before that was mostly based on symbolist theories, which among other things state that language use requires explicit rule-based mechanisms and explicit hierarchical encodings of language structure. And moreover, a view that is sometimes termed compositionality, concept representations retain their identity regardless of the context in which they occur. And in contrast to this, what Elman found is that ANNs can generate rule-following behavior without explicitly representing any of these rules, and that these representations vary according to the context in which they occur. And finally, that ANNs are able to represent indirect hierarchical encodings of the language structure. So apparently the network learned to use this fixed size vector of hidden recurrent activations in order to encode hierarchical language structure. Let's now take a look at another field in which connectionist modeling exerted a huge influence, which is the study of acquired disorders in the field of cognitive neuropsychology, where acquired disorders are disorders that you obtain through brain damage. And the approach in order to study these acquired disorders using connectionist networks is to first build a model of normal cognitive functioning and then damage this model in various ways, for example, by removing connections or neurons. And then we can observe how these various types of damage affect the model behavior. We can then use these observations to generate candidate explanations for acquired disorders. So let's take a look at an example. In the 1980s, the prevailing view in cognitive neuropsychology was that cognitive systems are comprised of independent modular components that could fail independently. What gave rise to this view was the phenomenon of double dissociations. So if we have two distinct cognitive abilities, A and B, and if we can observe that in certain patients A can be lost while B is still intact, or B can be lost while A is still intact, then it was inferred that A and B must be generated by different underlying independent modular mechanisms. And Plaut tested this approach by building and training a connectionist network, a single network that was not composed of two components, but rather one network that was then trained to perform both tasks A and B. And then he damaged this network in various ways. And what he observed was that he could recreate double dissociations between these tasks A and B without having actual separation of cognitive modules. So what this shows is that this absolute modularity hypothesis is not required to explain the phenomenon of double dissociation, but rather that this phenomenon can also be created by a partially modular architecture. Now, if we observe this network, we can see that actually the network does create some form of separation. So certain neurons become more important to perform task A, and other neurons become more important to performing task B in this training. But there's no strict dividing line in this model between uh, structures that correspond to the function A and structures that correspond to the function B. Now, another field in which connections modeling can be useful is in the study of developmental disorders like autism or various forms of language impairment, and even individual variability, for example, differences in intelligence between different human subjects. And the way we can study these is by manipulating the various model constraints, like the model architecture, the choice of input-output representations, the learning algorithm, or the training data, in order to simulate either genetic differences or exposure to atypical environments. And then we can observe how these various types of manipulations affect the model performance. And then we can use these observations to generate candidate explanations for developmental disorders and individual variability. Now, some examples of questions that can be explored this way are differences in intelligence caused by changes in the same computational properties as disorders? And this then leads to the follow-up question, are disorders just the extreme lower end of a normal distribution with where disorders come to certain degrees and there's no clear dividing line between disorder or not disorder? Or, as opposed to that, are disorders a qualitatively different situation? And additionally, we can also ask ourselves what computational properties can cause giftedness or above average performance. And one thesis that was explored this way by Karmeloff-Smith in 1998 and a follow-up paper by Karmeloff-Smith and Thomas in 2003 was the thesis that developmental disorders and variability in the normal range could be explained by genetic deficits which change the low-level neurocomputational properties, which then exerts an influence on cognitive abilities through an atypical development process. So let's summarize what we've learned. We started out by reviewing some of the key properties of connectionist networks, which are that long-term knowledge is stored in the strength of the connections, that processing is characterized by patterns of activations that are simultaneously influenced by multiple sources of information at different levels of abstraction. Furthermore, we've seen that these representations are graded, context sensitive, and the emergent product of adaptive processes, primarily weight learning rules. And finally, we've seen that computation is similarity based and driven by the statistical structure of the problem domains. Thank you all for watching, and if you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comments.